Abigail Turner pressed a small wooden pendant against her lips and whispered the name she had carried for 20 years. Nathaniel then walked through the church doors to marry him. He did not recognize her. He stood at the altar with his jaw set and his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. And when the Reverend finished and Nathaniel finally looked at her, truly looked, there was nothing in his face. No memory, no flash of recognition, nothing. That night, he poured himself a whiskey and said without turning around, "Don't mistake this marriage for something it isn't, Mrs. Brooks. You're here because I needed you to be. Nothing more." Abigail set the pendant down on the windowsill and said nothing. He had given her that pendant himself, 20 years ago, in a storm. When he was 10 years old, and she was the only person who hadn't left him alone in the dark. He had promised he would come back for her. He had. He just didn't know it. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Abigail all the way to the end. And drop a comment right now telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Abigail had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head, not the wedding itself. She had given up any romantic notions about the wedding months ago, the moment her father sat down at the kitchen table and couldn't look her in the eye. She had rehearsed the moment she would see his face again. The moment she would know for certain whether he remembered. She had told herself she was prepared for either answer. She was not prepared. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the front of the small church in Millhaven, Montana, with his hat in both hands and his eyes straight ahead, and he was so thoroughly, completely unchanged in the ways that mattered, the set of his jaw, the way he held himself like a man bracing against wind, that Abigail's breath left her body in one quiet rush before she could stop it. She caught herself, squared her shoulders, kept walking. He looked at her when she reached him. One long, assessing look, the kind you give a piece of land before you decide whether to buy it. Then he looked back at the Reverend. That was her answer. She said her vows without letting her voice shake, because she had decided the night before that it would not. When the Reverend pronounced them married, and Nathaniel placed the ring on her finger, his hand was steady and warm and utterly impersonal, the way a man's hand is when he's completing a transaction he's already made peace with. He nodded once at the Reverend. He turned toward the door. Abigail followed her husband out of the church into the gray October light, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her all right then. That's how it is. 11 people attended the wedding. Her parents. Her 2 younger brothers who were old enough to understand the arrangement and young enough to hate it, and who spent the entire ceremony staring at Nathaniel with the particular intensity of boys who have decided a man is guilty before the evidence is in. Clara Whitaker, Nathaniel's neighbor, who sat in the 3rd pew and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. A handful of ranch hands in their good shirts. No celebration afterward. No music, no dancing, no toasts. The ranch hands drifted back to work. Her family prepared for the long drive home. Her mother held her at the wagon for a long time. "Write to me," her mother said into her hair, "every week without fail." "I will." "And if he won't." Abigail pulled back and looked at her mother clearly. "Go home, Mama. Take care of Papa. The farm is safe now, that's what matters." Her mother cupped her face in both hands. Looked at her the way mothers do when they're memorizing something. "You matter," her mother said. "Don't you forget that." Abigail watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend. Then she stood alone in the yard, the wind pulling at her hair, and she breathed. Once, twice, a 3rd time. Then she picked up her bag and walked into her husband's house. She found the kitchen first. Poorly organized pantry. 3 cabinet doors that didn't close properly. A broken latch on the window above the sink, letting in a thin, mean draft. Evidence of cooking that relied heavily on salt and very little imagination. She was standing on her toes, reaching for the top shelf when she heard him come in behind her. "2nd cabinet on the left," Nathaniel said. She found the coffee, brought it down, turned to face him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not aggressively, just naturally, the posture of a man who occupied space without thinking about it. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her at the altar, measuring. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. The silence that followed had weight to it. Abigail set the coffee on the counter and decided right then that she was not going to spend this marriage studying floors. She looked at him directly. "I'd like to understand the household," she said. "The routine. What's being handled, what's been let go. You don't need to manage the house. I have—" "Who cooks?" He paused. "Mrs. Garrity, twice a week. And the other 5 days?" Another pause. "I manage," he said. She thought about the salt. "I'd like to be useful," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He studied her that long, careful assessment again. She held it without flinching. "Do what you like with the house," he said finally. "I'll stay out of your way." He pushed off from the doorframe. "Mr. Brooks." He stopped. "I understand what this is," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm not asking for more than you're willing to give, but I would appreciate honesty. If something needs saying between us, say it plainly." Nathaniel turned back slowly. Something moved through his face, a complexity she couldn't yet read. "All right," he said. "Plainly then, I married you because I had no other choice. My father made an agreement, and I honored it. I'll provide for you, protect you, treat you with respect. But don't expect my heart, Mrs. Turner. I used it up a long time ago, and there's nothing left worth offering." Abigail absorbed that, kept her face still. It was almost exactly what she had expected. Hearing it said aloud in that flat, certain voice still did something sharp and cold to the place behind her ribs. "Mrs. Brooks," she said. He blinked. "It's Mrs. Brooks," she said. "You told me so yourself not 2 hours ago." The silence stretched. Nathaniel stared at her. And something happened in his face. Something small and involuntary. There and gone, that might under very different circumstances have been the start of a smile. "Good night, Mrs. Brooks," he said. He walked out. Abigail pressed both palms flat against the counter, breathed slowly until the tightness behind her ribs eased, and then made the coffee. She drank it standing at the broken window in the dark. The pendant was upstairs in her trunk. She didn't need to look at it to see it clearly. She could close her eyes and feel the grain of the wood, the rough carved initials on the back. N.B. She had traced those letters so many times over the years that she sometimes thought she could feel them without touching anything at all. She learned him by watching, not romantically, practically. The way you learn a place you didn't choose but have to navigate by paying attention to what is said and what is carefully not said. By noting where the floor creaks and which doors stick and what the silences mean. Nathaniel woke before dawn every morning. She could hear him moving through the house in the gray dark quiet. Deliberate footsteps, the low sounds of a man who had lived alone long enough to stop thinking about whether anyone else could hear him. He was gone to the range before she was dressed. He returned after supper, ate whatever she left for him in the oven without comment, and disappeared to his study. He answered questions in the minimum number of words required. He said thank you for meals, which she hadn't expected, and said it with the exact same measured courtesy every time, which told her it was habit rather than feeling. He held doors. He fixed the broken cabinet latches within a week of her mentioning them without being asked twice. He did not raise his voice. He was in every technical sense a decent man. He was also as remote as the ridge behind the ranch and about as warm. She didn't beg for warmth. She had never begged for anything in her life, and she was not about to start. Instead, she built. She reorganized the pantry and fixed the drafty window latch herself with a tool she found in the shed. She started teaching the ranch hands children in the afternoons. 3 of them initially, then 5 gathered around her kitchen table with slates and chalk, while she walked them through letters and numbers and on Friday stories. She helped the ranch cook plan better meals and showed him gently that salt was a seasoning and not a food group. She began spending Sunday mornings at the small church in Millhaven, where she quickly learned which families were struggling and began quietly leaving food at doors. No one asked her to do any of this. She did it because she was not built for stillness, and because there was work to be done, and because the best way she knew to survive a life that hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped was to make herself useful inside it. The first time Nathaniel walked in on a lesson, He stopped dead in the doorway. 5 children at the table, heads bent over slates. Rosie Hatch, 7 years old, tongue between her teeth, drawing a careful letter. A. The Beaumont boys, boys 8 and 10, competing over who could write their name faster. 2 sisters from the Calloway family, both of whom had never held chalk before last Tuesday, now writing full sentences. Abigail stood at the far end of the table watching and looked up when she heard him come in. Rosie looked up too. Mr. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks is teaching us how letters make words. I can write my whole name now. You want to see? Nathaniel's eyes moved from Rosie to Abigail's face. Back to Rosie. That's something, he said in a voice that was not unfriendly. Rosie beamed and bent back over her slate with renewed intensity. Nathaniel waited until the children had gone before he spoke. When he finally turned to Abigail, his voice was careful. You don't need to take on extra work. I know. Their families aren't paying you. I know that too. He crossed his arms. Then why? Abigail looked at him squarely. Because children should know how to read, Mr. Brooks, and they want to learn, and I can teach them. She paused. And because this house is very quiet in the afternoons. Something shifted in his expression at that. Something she hadn't expected, something almost like guilt. If the noise bothers you, he started. The noise is the best part of my day, she said. I wasn't complaining. He was quiet. She could see him working through something, some internal resistance, some old reluctance, and then setting it down. Fine, he said. You say that a great deal, Abigail said. He looked at her. Fine, she repeated. You say it like you're granting permission. She held his gaze. I wasn't asking for permission, Mr. Brooks. I was telling you. The silence that followed was different from the others. Charged, like the air before lightning. Nathaniel Brooks looked at his wife. Really looked the way he hadn't looked since the church, and something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Fair enough, he said quietly. He reached for his hat and walked out. Abigail turned to the window and let out a long breath through her nose. She realized, almost smiling. Clara Whitaker came the following week with preserved peaches and an agenda she didn't bother to hide. She sat across from Abigail at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at her steadily. I wanted to see what kind of woman Nathaniel married, Clara said plainly. Word travels in this valley. What does word say? Abigail asked. That you're a farmer's daughter, that your family was near bankrupt, that the whole thing was arranged by Franklin before he died. Clara tilted her head. Is any of that wrong? None of it, Abigail said. How is he treating you? Abigail poured the coffee before she answered. She chose her words carefully. Exactly as he said he would. He's respectful. He's correct. He provides everything I could need. But, Abigail looked at her. Clara had the kind of eyes that didn't accept halfway answers. He's not unkind, Abigail said. He's just not there, even when he's standing in the same room. Clara nodded slowly. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He wasn't always like that, she said. Abigail went very still. When he was a boy, Clara continued, he was something else entirely. Bright as anything. Curious about everything. Horses, weather, anything he could get his hands on to read. He used to follow my husband around the farm asking questions for hours. A brief fond look crossed her face. Then when he was about 10, he took sick. A real bad fever. 2 weeks it lasted. She paused. When it broke, he was quieter. His mother said he'd lost pieces of things. Whole stretches of memory gone. Names, places, moments. She looked at Abigail steadily. He never talked about it, but I always thought it frightened him not knowing what was real. So he just stopped reaching for things. Decided it was safer not to. The kitchen was very quiet. You're not making excuses for him, Abigail said. It wasn't a question. No, Clara said. I'm giving you a map. She held Abigail's gaze. There are things he lost in that fever that never came back. I don't know which ones. I'm not sure he does either. After Clara left, Abigail sat at the table for a long time without moving. A fever. A boy who forgot. Whole stretches gone. She pressed her hand flat against the table surface and thought about the pendant upstairs in the trunk and the initials carved into the back, and a 10-year-old boy shivering in the dark hollow of an oak tree while the storm raged, looking at her with eyes that were terrified and determined in equal measure. "I'll come back for you," he had said. "I promise, Abigail." She had believed him completely. She had believed him for years afterward, the way children believe things without conditions, without expiration. She had grown older, and the belief had changed shape, become less like expectation, and more like a scar she carried carefully. Still there. Still hers. She had known him the moment she walked into that church. She had not said a word, because what would she have said? What could she have possibly said, standing at an altar in her mother's dress to a man who looked at her and saw a stranger? "You promised me once, and then you forgot me. You came back, but you don't know you came back. And I still have the thing you gave me. I've been carrying it for 20 years. She hadn't said any of it. She had simply said her vows in a voice that didn't shake, and put on the ring, and followed him out of the church. She had not yet decided whether that made her brave or foolish. Some days, she suspected it was both. Thomas Reed arrived on a Friday in November. He came about a shared fence line, and Nathaniel wasn't back from the south pasture, and so he sat at Abigail's kitchen table and accepted her coffee with a genuine smile and talked to her like a person. That was the thing about Thomas Reed. He talked to her like a person. He asked about her teaching, not politely, curiously. He asked what she thought of Montana winters, and listened to the answer, and then disagreed with her mildly about the merits of December over January, which made her laugh because she hadn't expected to be disagreed with, and found she appreciated it. He told her about his own cooking disasters after his wife passed, and the suffering he'd inflicted on himself before hiring help, and he told it well, and she laughed again. How was easy, comfortable. The kind of man who makes a room feel larger just by being at ease in it. She had almost forgotten what that felt like. She was still smiling when Nathaniel came through the back door. He stopped. It was barely a beat, half a second less, but Abigail saw it. She was watching for it without knowing she was watching for it. And she saw the exact moment Nathaniel's eyes moved from Thomas to her face and registered something. His expression didn't change. His posture didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted, tightened. Thomas stood and extended his hand. "Brooks, hope you don't mind your wife kept me company." "Reed." Nathaniel shook his hand. Even voice, neutral face. "What brings you out?" They talked about the fence, about winter grazing rights, about a horse. The whole time Nathaniel stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and his eyes moved. Thomas Abigail Thomas in a slow, methodical circuit that she recognized. It was the same look he used on fence lines, checking for weakness, calculating what might give. Thomas left 20 minutes later with a handshake and a tip of his hat to Abigail. "Mrs. Brooks, always a pleasure." "Mr. Reed," she said. "Come back any time." She felt, rather than saw, Nathaniel's eyes move to her face. After the door closed, the kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel stayed. That was the thing he stayed, which he never did. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and looked out the window at the yard and said nothing. Abigail put the cups in the wash basin. Let the silence sit. Then evenly, "He's a decent man." "He is," Nathaniel said. "He was just waiting for you." "I know that." She glanced at him sideways. His jaw was set. His eyes hadn't moved from the window. "Nathaniel." It was the first time she had used his given name. She watched his shoulders pull very slightly, almost imperceptibly at the sound of it. "I'm not interested in Thomas Reed." A long pause. "I didn't say you were," he said. "You didn't have to." He was quiet. The muscle in his jaw moved. "He looked at you like—" He stopped. Started again. "He talked to you like he knew you." "We talked for 20 minutes over coffee," Abigail said. "That's all." "That's more than—" He stopped again, harder this time, like he'd caught himself at the edge of something he hadn't meant to say. Abigail waited. Nathaniel set his cup down. He turned and looked at her directly, and for the first time she saw something underneath the careful distance, something raw-edged and unwilling. "I don't know how to," he said, and then stopped completely. The sentence just ended, unfinished, hanging in the air between them. Abigail looked at him steadily. Her voice when she spoke was very quiet. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he'd ever held it before. Then he reached for his hat and walked out. Abigail stood in the empty kitchen and breathed through the strange, complicated ache in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite grief. Something balanced precisely between the two, and stared at the window for a long time. The storm that hit in December was the kind that shut a ranch down completely. No one went out. The snow came horizontal, and the temperature dropped so fast the water in the livestock troughs frosted over in under an hour. By nightfall, the ranch house was sealed in with the fire as the only source of heat, and the wind was doing something almost personal against the walls. Nathaniel came in late, snow-stiff, and stood in front of the fire with his hands spread toward the heat. Abigail handed him coffee without being asked. He took it. He didn't leave. She took the armchair. He stayed at the fireplace. The storm pressed around the house and the fire crackled, and neither of them spoke, but the silence was different this time. Not the hollow, avoidant silence of their ordinary evenings, but something fuller, something that had presence and texture. Then Nathaniel said, "My father used to love these storms." Abigail looked up. He was watching the fire. Said they were the only time the ranch was truly quiet. Everything stopped. Nowhere to go. He called it the land making you sit still. "He sounds like a thoughtful man," Abigail said carefully. He was. A pause. "Among other things." She gave him a moment. Then gently, "What do you think about when a storm shuts everything down like this?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "I don't know," he said. And the honesty in it, unguarded, almost helpless, made her chest tighten. He wasn't being evasive. He genuinely didn't know. There were rooms inside him he couldn't enter. Abigail looked at her hands in her lap. She chose her next words with great care. "When I was young," she said, "storms frightened me. We lived near the woods and they came fast." She kept her voice light, conversational. "Once when I was 9, a very bad one came through. I found a boy who was lost. He'd wandered off from somewhere, and the storm caught him in the open, and I found him in the hollow of an old oak tree." Nathaniel had gone still. "We waited it out together," she said. "A few hours maybe. We were both frightened, but we didn't say so because neither of us wanted the other to feel worse." She paused. "He was brave. Very brave, even though I could feel him shaking." The fire popped. "What happened to him?" Nathaniel's voice was low. "Careful. His family found him. He was all right." She smiled briefly at her hands. "Before we separated, he gave me something he'd made, something he'd carved." She could feel her own heartbeat. She kept her voice steady. "He said he'd come back for me one day." A long silence. "Did he?" Nathaniel asked. Abigail lifted her eyes to his face. I was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not assessing. Not closed. Something open and searching and almost frightened, like a man standing at the edge of a memory he can't quite see into. "I don't know yet," she said softly. The fire crackled. The storm screamed against the walls. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, that long searching look, and then something seemed to pull shut inside him, the way a shutter closes against weather. He looked back at the fire. "Sounds like the kind of thing a person remembers," he said quietly. Abigail's breath moved carefully in and out of her chest. "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't say anything else. She picked up her mending and her needle, and she worked in silence while the storm raged on, and she didn't look at him again, and she felt with a certainty that was almost painful that she was standing at the very edge of something enormous. Something that was not yet ready to break open, but would. She pressed her thumb against the small callus on her left hand, the one from years of holding a certain piece of carved wood, and she breathed and she waited, and the fire burned low and the storm went on. The storm passed. Everything quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something important, when the world hasn't yet decided what happens next. Abigail woke the morning after to find Nathaniel already gone, same as always. But on the kitchen table set beside her coffee cup, with the deliberateness of a man who had thought about it and then almost changed his mind, was a small bundle of firewood, the dry good kind, the kind he kept in the back shed for himself. Not the green wood from the pile outside her door. His. She stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she made the coffee and didn't say a word about it when she saw him at supper. But she noticed. She noticed everything. That was the thing about Nathaniel Brooks that she was beginning to understand. He did not speak in words when he could avoid it. He spoke in actions. The firewood. The cabinet latches fixed without being asked twice. The way he'd started timing his return from the south pasture to arrive before full dark, which meant he was always home when her last student left, which she suspected was not accidental. He was trying. In the only language he knew. She was learning to hear it. What she had not anticipated, what she hadn't let herself consider, because hoping for it felt too much like setting herself up for a particular kind of fall, was that she was beginning to like him. Not the distant stone wall version of him she'd married, but the man she caught in unguarded moments. The way he crouched down to Rosie Hatch's level when the little girl stopped him in the yard to show him something she'd written and actually looked at the slate and said, "That's a fine letter. Miss Rosie." With such plain sincerity that Rosie had glowed for an hour. The way he stood at the fence on cold mornings with his coffee and watched the ridge like it was telling him something, and sometimes she'd glance out the window and think he looks lonely. He's been lonely for so long, he doesn't know what else to feel. She caught herself looking out that window more than was strictly necessary. She told herself it was just observation. She was a practical woman. She suspected lying to herself. It was Clara Whitaker who said it plainly, the way Clara always did. She arrived on a Tuesday with no particular excuse, sat down with her coffee, and said without preamble, "You've stopped sleeping in your mother's expression." Abigail looked up from the table. "My mother's expression, the one you wore for the first month." Clara tilted her head. "Like you were doing a hard thing and had decided to endure it. That look." She studied Abigail. "It's different now." Abigail turned her cup in her hands. She didn't answer immediately because she was trying to decide whether the answer was something she was ready to say out loud. "He left me firewood," she said finally. Clara blinked. Then her mouth curved. "He did. From his personal supply. Said nothing about it. Just left it on the table." Clara shook her head slowly, something fond and a little sad in her expression. "Nathaniel Brooks," she said mostly to herself. "Leaving firewood." She looked at Abigail. "Did he look at you differently after the storm?" "Yes." No hesitation. "How so?" Abigail thought about those last minutes at the fire. His voice sounds like the kind of thing a person remembers. The way his face had opened for just a moment before the shutter came back down. Like he was trying to remember something he couldn't quite reach, she said. The kitchen went quiet. Clara set her cup down very carefully. "Abigail," she said, and her voice had changed lower, more cautious. "There's something I should have told you sooner." Abigail went still. "The storm boy," Clara said. "The one you told me about last week. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure." She met Abigail's eyes directly. "But I think I know who that was." The air in the kitchen shifted. "When Nathaniel was 10, Clara said, he went missing for almost 4 hours during a bad storm. His mother was half out of her mind. They found him just before dark, wet through feverish. He was talking about a girl who'd found him and kept him safe." She paused. "A girl named Abigail." The sound of her own name in that context landed somewhere inside her chest, like a stone into still water. "He remembered her name," Abigail said. Her voice came out very quiet. "For a while," Clara said, "before the fever took it." She looked at her steadily. "He used to talk about her sometimes, even after, even when most of it was gone. He'd say there was a girl. She was kind. I made her a promise." She swallowed. He never remembered what the promise was, just that he'd made one and hadn't kept it. The guilt. 20 years of guilt for a promise he couldn't even remember making. Abigail pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. "He knows he forgot something," she said. "He carries it." "Yes," Clara said softly. "He does." The two women sat in that kitchen in silence, and outside the wind moved through the pines along the ridge, and Abigail thought very slowly, very carefully, about a man who had spent 2 decades carrying the weight of a broken promise to a girl whose face he couldn't see anymore. She thought about what it would mean to give that back to him. She thought about whether she was ready. She wasn't sure. But the time for not deciding was running out. She could feel it, the same way you feel weather coming before the sky changes. Something was going to break open. She just didn't know yet which of them would break it first. It turned out to be neither of them. It was a letter. It arrived the second week of January. A thin envelope, formal handwriting addressed to Nathaniel, and left on the front hall table with the rest of the post. She didn't see it until the following morning, when she came downstairs and found Nathaniel standing in the hall, still in his work coat, holding the open letter in both hands, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She stopped on the stairs. He looked up. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to say anything. But something had shifted in him overnight. She could see at some internal wall that had cracked without his permission. "My father had a brother," he said, "in Oregon. I never knew him. They had a falling out before I was born." She came the rest of the way down the stairs. "What does he want?" Nathaniel looked back at the letter. "He's dying. He wants to settle the family estate before he goes." A pause. "He says there are papers my father signed, documents that could affect the ranch's ownership." He lowered the letter. "He's asking me to come." "Oregon," Abigail said. "Bend, a week's ride." She looked at him carefully. "Are you going?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what he has. I don't know if it's legitimate or if it's—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "My father borrowed against this land twice. If there are documents I don't know about—" "Then you need to know," Abigail said. He looked at her. "You go," she said. "I'll manage the ranch." The look on his face was something between surprise and resistance. "You can't run a ranch alone. The men won't—" "The men know me," Abigail said simply. "I've been bringing them lunch for 2 months, Mr. Brooks. I know all their names and their children's names and which ones take their coffee black." She met his gaze. "They'll listen." He stared at her for a long moment. "You'd do that," he said. Not a question. More like he was testing whether it was real. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." Something moved across his face quietly, deeply. He folded the letter. "I'll be back in 10 days, he said. 12 at the outside. Take what you need. I'll write to you if something goes wrong." He reached for his hat. Then he stopped, turned back. Abigail. Her name. Her given name for the first time. Her breath went shallow and she kept her face perfectly still. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he never said thank you for meals, not from habit, not from courtesy. From something genuine and undefended, like a man who had finally gotten close enough to mean it. She nodded once. He walked out. She stood in the empty hall for a long time, after the door closed, and pressed one hand to the side of her face, and thought very carefully, very deliberately, about absolutely nothing at all. 10 days alone ran the ranch, and it nearly ran her into the ground. By day 3, she understood fully why Nathaniel came home after supper every night, and said nothing because by evening there was nothing left. She was up before dawn, out with the ranch hands by first light, learning which pastures needed rotating and which fence sections had been letting the south herd drift, and how to read the mountain weather before it became a problem. Wade Garrett, the foreman, a weathered man of 50, who had been skeptical of her for approximately 6 hours before she correctly identified a lame front leg on one of his favorite horses and told him exactly what to do about it, became her primary educator, and somewhere around day 4, something close to an ally. "You know livestock," he said, not quite a question on the 5th morning. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "A smaller one. But yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Boss know that?" He knows I'm a farmer's daughter. Wade made a sound that might have been a laugh. Reckon there's a few things about you the boss hasn't quite figured out yet. She didn't answer that, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. Thomas Reed came by on the 7th day. He came with a practical reason, a question about the shared fence they'd repaired in November, and she handled it efficiently, answered his questions clearly, and walked the fence line with him herself to show him where the post holes needed resetting. He was easy company, same as before. He made her laugh twice, and didn't push past easy when easy was all she was offering. But when he tipped his hat to leave, he paused. "He treating you right?" Thomas asked. Directly. No preamble. Abigail looked at him. "You could ask him yourself." "I'm asking you." She considered that for a moment. She thought about the firewood, about the cabinet latches, about the way he'd said her name for the first time in the hall. "He's learning," she said. Thomas held her gaze for a moment. "That's a kind answer. It's the true one." He nodded like he'd heard more in what she'd said than just the words. He mounted up and rode out, and Abigail watched him go, and felt with a certainty that settled quietly into her bones that she was not confused about Thomas Reed at all. She was confused about her husband. That was a different and considerably more complicated problem. Nathaniel came back on the 11th day. She heard the horse before she saw him late afternoon, the light already going amber over the ridge, and she was at the fence with Wade when he rode in. He looked tired. 2 weeks of hard riding, tired, the kind that lives in the eyes and the set of the shoulders. He dismounted, handed the reins to one of the hands, and crossed the yard. He saw her at the fence and came directly to her. "How'd it go?" she asked. "There are papers," he said. His voice was flat, controlled. "My uncle had documents my father signed 30 years ago. A partial stake in the ranch ceded in exchange for a debt." He paused. "It's legitimate. I've already spoken to a lawyer in Billings." She absorbed that. "What does it mean?" "It means the ranch isn't entirely mine." He looked at the fence line rather than at her. "He has a legal claim to the eastern quarter, the good pasture." "Can it be bought back?" "Possibly, if I can raise the capital." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not interested in money. He wants the land." Another pause. "He says he'll discuss terms when he's well enough to travel, which could be weeks." Abigail looked at him steadily. The tiredness in him was more than physical. She could see it, the particular weight of a man who had ridden out with one problem and come back with 3. "Come inside," she said. "Eat something." He looked at her then. "You don't have to. I made supper 2 hours ago and kept it warm," she said. "Come inside, Nathaniel." His name again. She watched it land on him the same way it had the first time, that slight catch, like a man who hears a familiar sound from a direction he didn't expect. He followed her inside. She put the food in front of him and poured the coffee and sat across from him at the table, and he ate. Actually ate the way a man eats when he's been subsisting on trail food for 11 days, and she watched him start to come back into himself, the rigid tiredness softening slightly at the edges. He looked up at her. "How did the ranch go?" Fence on the south side needed 2 new post holes. The hatch mare was favoring her left front. I had Wade look at it. "It's a bruised sole. She'll be fine in a week. Your foreman is an excellent judge of horses and a deeply mediocre cook." She paused. "I reorganized the supply shed. I hope that's all right." Nathaniel stared at her. "Again," he said, "not asking permission." "Again," she said, "telling you." He made a sound low and brief, somewhere between a breath and something that might have been a laugh. It was the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard him make, and it lasted less than a second, but it was real, and it was warm, and it hit her somewhere under the sternum like an unexpected step. "Wade said you knew livestock," Nathaniel said. "Wade talks too much." "He said you spotted the hatch mare's lameness before anyone else. Said you knew what to do without asking." "I grew up on a working farm," she said simply. He was looking at her in that way again, the deep, searching way, the one that lived closer to the surface lately. "What else don't I know about you?" It was not a casual question. He meant it. She held his gaze across the table and thought about what to say, and decided for the first time to give him just a little more truth than she had before. "I used to walk in the woods alone when I was a child," she said. "My mother thought it was too dangerous. I went anyway." She watched his face. "I wasn't afraid of storms. I was afraid of people who weren't honest. I always thought I'd rather face a storm than a liar." Something changed in his expression. She couldn't name it exactly. Recognition, maybe. The cousin of it. "You still feel that way?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Always." He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then he nodded once and looked back down at his food. But before he did, she saw it the way his brow had drawn together. The way his eyes had gone briefly inward, like a man searching for something on the inside of himself that he knows should be there and can't quite find. She said nothing. She refilled his coffee and let the silence sit between them. And it was the most companionable silence they had shared, yet full rather than empty, warm rather than cold, the kind of silence that meant neither person felt the need to fill it. After supper, he stayed at the table longer than usual. He picked up his coffee cup and then put it down and then picked it up again in a way that told her he was trying to decide whether to say something. She waited. "My uncle," he said finally. "When I was there, he talked about my father, things I didn't know." He stopped. "Good things or bad things?" she asked carefully. "Both." He turned the cup in his hands. "He said my father spent years feeling guilty about something that happened before I was born, a debt he never fully repaid." A pause. "He wouldn't say what it was, said it wasn't his story to tell." He looked up at her. "Did you know my father before the arrangement?" "He came to our farm twice," she said. "He was kind. He always took his hat off when he spoke to my mother." Something softened in Nathaniel's face. "That sounds like him." "He looked at me carefully," she said, "when he proposed the arrangement to my father, like he was making sure." She paused. "I thought he was just being thorough, but now I wonder." Nathaniel was very still. "Wonder what?" he said. She held his gaze and spoke carefully. "If he knew more about me than he said." The silence that followed was the loudest they had ever shared. Nathaniel looked at her deeply, searchingly the way he had by the fire during the storm, and something was working in him, something slow and enormous, and not quite ready to surface. Then Wade knocked at the back door about the south herd, and the moment dissolved. Nathaniel pushed back his chair and reached for his coat, and Abigail turned to the counter and pressed her palms flat against the edge and breathed. Franklin Brooks. The arrangement. A debt he never fully repaid. She thought about a dying man in Oregon with documents, 30 years old. She thought about a father who had ridden out to a struggling farmer's house and looked at the farmer's daughter with careful, deliberate eyes. She thought for the first time that maybe she wasn't the only one who had known who Abigail Turner was. Maybe Franklin Brooks had always known. Maybe the arrangement had never been about the debt at all. February came and the ranch found its rhythm, and so quietly, without announcement, did they. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was Nathaniel appearing at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings when she was teaching not to interrupt, but simply to be there, sitting at the far end with his accounts ledger and his coffee close enough to be present. It was Abigail beginning to leave a cup of coffee on the porch railing on the evenings he sat out there without comment, the same way he'd left the firewood, a small language neither of them named. It was the evening he found her at the fence after dark, staring at the ridge, and instead of asking if she was all right, he simply came and stood beside her and looked at the same ridge. 15 minutes. They stood like that, shoulder, almost to shoulder. The cold coming off the hills and their breath-making small clouds in the dark. He didn't ask what she was thinking. She didn't tell him. But when she finally turned to go inside, he said, "You don't have to figure everything out alone, you know." She stopped. He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at the ridge. "Neither do you," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I'm beginning to learn that." She went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while before she could make herself do anything else. Something was happening between them that neither had planned for. Something that lived in small gestures and unfinished sentences and the specific weight of a silence shared willingly. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was not sure she was ready to. What she knew was this: every time she came close to the truth, close to the thing she'd carried for 20 years, she pulled back. Not from cowardice, from something she hadn't expected to feel. She was afraid of what would happen when he remembered. Not afraid he would reject it. Afraid he would feel obligated. Afraid he would look at her and see not his wife, but a debt. Another arrangement. Another thing he owed. She did not want to be owed. She wanted if she was honest. If she let herself be fully honest in the quiet of her own thoughts, she wanted him to choose her. Without the weight of the past. Without guilt or obligation. Just him choosing her the way she had chosen to keep that promise alive for 20 years without anyone asking her to. She pressed her hand against her chest and thought, is that asking too much? Then Thomas Reed came back, and everything changed. He arrived on a Thursday, and this time he didn't come about the fence. He came because he'd heard about the uncle in Oregon and the claim on the eastern pasture, and he had a proposition. He'd buy the disputed quarter himself, fair market price, give Nathaniel the capital he needed to buy it back at a profit in 2 years if the ranch had a good season. It was a practical offer. A generous offer. And he made it to Abigail first. Because Nathaniel wasn't home. I wanted to talk to you before him, Thomas said, sitting at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his expression serious. Because you're the one he'll listen to. Abigail looked at him carefully. Am I? Don't tell me you haven't noticed, Thomas said, not unkindly. I've known Nathaniel Brooks for 8 years. I've never seen him listen to anyone the way he listens to you. She kept her face still and said nothing. He watches you, Thomas said. Every time you leave a room he watches the door. He paused. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you know, and I think you're being careful with it. And I want you to know you're right to be careful. He's not going to say it first. He doesn't know how. She looked at this man, kind, uncomplicated, deeply decent. Thomas Reed, and felt a wave of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite sadness, but lived somewhere between. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then honestly, because you deserve to know what you have, before you decide it isn't enough. He put his hat on. Tell him about my offer. He won't take charity, but he'll consider partnership. He moved toward the door, then stopped. And Mrs. Brooks, whatever you're waiting for him to do, I think he's closer than you think. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she heard the door, the particular sound of Nathaniel's boots on the back step, and she turned. He came in and saw her face and stopped. What happened? He said immediately. Not are you all right, not what's wrong. What happened, because he had learned her well enough to know the difference between troubled and she was shaken. Thomas Reed was here, she said. He has a proposition about the eastern pasture. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. I'll speak to him. Nathaniel. She held his gaze. Listen to me first. He stopped. He looked at her, and he waited fully with all of his attention in a way that would have been impossible for him 3 months ago. She told him about the offer. She told him it was fair, and that Thomas had asked to speak to her first, and why. She watched his face move through the information, the resistance, the pride, the careful calculation underneath. And then she said very quietly, He told me something else. Nathaniel's eyes held hers. He said you watch the door when I leave a room, she said. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nathaniel Brooks stood in his work coat with his hat in his hand and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he had no walls up. None. Every single careful constructed distance just gone. He looked at her the way the storm had looked the night before it hit, enormous and inevitable, and right on the edge of breaking. How was right, Nathaniel said. His voice was very low. She pressed her hand against her sternum. Her heart was doing something dramatic and unhelpful. Nathaniel, she started. I don't know how to do this, he said. Low, rough, the words pulled out of him like something that had been stuck a long time. I've been trying to figure out how to say... He stopped. His jaw worked. I look at you and I feel like I'm another stop. Like I'm missing something I can't name. Like there's something just past the edge of what I can see, and if I could just... He shook his head, frustrated. I don't know how to explain it. She couldn't breathe. Like a memory, she said. He looked at her sharply. Yes, he said. Exactly like that. Like a memory I can't get to. His eyes moved over her face with that searching, desperate intensity. Abigail, do you know... He stopped again. Started again. Have we... The question hung in the air between them, unfinished and enormous and quivering. She looked at him. This man, this complicated, closed, slowly opening man, who had been carrying a promise he couldn't remember for 20 years. And she felt every careful, patient, self-protective instinct she had scream at her to wait, to let him find it himself. He was so close. I think, she said very carefully, that some things are worth finding on your own. He stared at her. His eyes were dark and intent and searching. Help me, he said. 2 words, stripped of everything but the need in them. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said quietly, Your father's study, the old wooden chest against the wall. She held very still. Look inside it. He didn't move for a moment. Then he set his hat on the table and walked out of the kitchen, and she heard his footsteps down the hall, and she stood alone in the kitchen with her hand pressed flat against her chest and her eyes closed, and she thought, all right, here we go, here it comes. She heard him open the study door. She heard the old chest creak. She stood very still and waited, and the house was so quiet she could hear the wind in the pines and her own heartbeat and nothing else. Then silence, a long, deep silence, and then his voice from all the way down the hall saying her name. Not Mrs. Brooks, not Miss Turner. Abigail, the way you say a name when you are not calling someone, when you are finally recognizing them. She opened her eyes. She pressed her lips together. She breathed. She walked to the door of the kitchen and stopped at the threshold, and she waited. His footsteps came down the hall. Slow, measured the footsteps of a man who is walking towards something enormous, and then he appeared in the doorway, and he was holding something in his right hand. A small carved wooden pendant. He held it like it weighed everything. His eyes found hers across the room, and they were different now, different from any way he had ever looked at her before. Open in a way she had never seen him be open. Raw, real. In his other hand was a faded piece of paper. She knew without reading it what it said. For the boy who promised to come back. He looked at her. His voice when it came was barely more than a breath. It was you, he said. She didn't move. She didn't look away. Yes, she said. The word settled into the room between them, like the first stone dropped into still water, small and quiet, and the beginning of everything. He stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough that Abigail began to understand this was not the moment she had imagined. She had imagined relief. She had imagined the weight lifting. She had imagined him crossing the room and saying something that would make the last 20 years make sense. Instead, Nathaniel Brooks stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, holding a carved wooden pendant and a piece of faded paper, and he looked at her like a man who had just discovered the floor beneath him was not where he thought it was. How long, he said. His voice was careful, controlled, the way it got when he was holding something down with both hands. Since the church, Abigail said. He absorbed that. The wedding, he said. You knew at the wedding. Yes. And you said nothing. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. No, she said. I didn't. The muscle in his jaw moved. He looked down at the pendant in his hand, then back up at her. Why? She had thought about this answer for months. She had rehearsed it a dozen ways in the dark of her room, turning it over like a stone to find the truest version underneath. Because I didn't want you to feel obligated, she said. I didn't want you looking at me and seeing a debt. Another arrangement. Another thing you owed someone. She held his gaze steadily. You'd already had enough of those. Nathaniel was very still. That wasn't your decision to make, he said quietly. Maybe not, she said. But it was the one I made. The silence stretched between them, not the comfortable silence they'd built over months, but something with edges. Something that needed to be handled carefully. He set the pendant down on the table between them. He set the paper down beside it. He looked at them both for a moment, and then he looked at her, and when he spoke his voice was lower. "I've been carrying guilt for 20 years, he said. "For a promise I couldn't remember making. I knew I'd failed someone. I didn't know who." His eyes moved over her face. "And you were here, right here, every day. And you knew." "Yes," she said. "And you let me carry it." The words landed hard. She absorbed them without flinching, because she had asked herself the same thing in the dark enough times to have an honest answer. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I was waiting for you to be ready." "Ready," he repeated. "You weren't a man who could have heard it when we married Nathaniel. You would have reorganized it, made it into something you owed me, another transaction." She kept her voice even. "I wanted you to know me first. The person, not the story." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the pendant and held it out to her. She took it. She hadn't held it in months. She'd left it in the chest deliberately the night she'd told him where to look. It was smaller than she remembered. Or maybe her hands were larger. "I made that," he said. "I was 10 years old and I was terrified, and you sat with me for 3 hours in the dark, and you talked to me, so I wouldn't think about how scared I was." Something moved through his face. "I remember that now. Not clearly, but I remember the feeling of it. Someone choosing to stay." She pressed her thumb against the carved initials. "You were very brave," she said softly, "for a boy that frightened." "I wasn't brave," he said. "I was holding on to you." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Abigail looked at the pendant in her hands and thought very carefully about the next thing she said, because she could feel the conversation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong word, and it would fall into recrimination, into guilt, into the exact kind of obligation she had spent months trying to prevent. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Now that you know." He looked at her sharply, like he hadn't expected that to be the question. "What do I want?" he repeated. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, old habits of suppression, of shutting things down before they could hurt him. And she watched him fight those habits visibly in a way he never would have let her see 3 months ago. "I want to understand what I've lost," he said finally. "And I want the chance to—" He stopped. His hands opened at his sides. "I don't know how to ask for things I don't deserve." "You could start by asking," she said, "and let me decide what you deserve." He looked at her, and for just a moment the full weight of everything crossed his face. The guilt, the grief, the long, slow, careful thing that had been building between them for months, and underneath all of it, something that had been there from the very beginning, waiting. He reached across this table and picked up the pendant. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it back in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it," he said. "It was always yours." She held his gaze and her hand and said nothing. He stepped back, picked up his hat from the table. He was not running. She could see the difference now between Nathaniel retreating out of fear and Nathaniel stepping back to get a longer view. "I need to think," he said. "All right," she said. He walked out. Abigail stood alone in the kitchen with the pendant in her closed fist, and she breathed, and she did not cry, and she thought, "All right. The hard part starts now." She was right. The next 3 days were the strangest of their marriage. Nathaniel did not retreat. That was the first thing she noticed and held on to. He didn't go cold, didn't rebuild the stone wall distance. He was simply careful. The way a man is careful when he's moving through territory he doesn't have a map for and knows it. How was home for supper every night. He sat at the table while she taught in the mornings, ledger open, but not always working. He answered her questions with full sentences now, which was new and sometimes offered information. She hadn't asked for small things, observations about the ranch, a memory that had surfaced. The memories were coming back, not all at once, in pieces like ice breaking up in a spring thaw, slow at first, then faster. On the second evening, he said without looking up from his coffee, "You used to hump when you were thinking. Even then. That day in the storm. Abigail went still at the counter. I don't remember that. You did, he said, low under your breath, like you didn't know you were doing it. He looked up. You still do it, in the mornings when you're making coffee. She turned back to the counter because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't his face. On the third day, Clara Whitaker arrived. She came in with the particular briskness of a woman who has heard something through the very efficient communications network of a small Montana valley and has opinions about it. She sat down at Abigail's kitchen table, accepted coffee without asking for it, and said, 2 in the morning, 3 nights running, going through his father's study. I see, Abigail said. He found something besides the pendant, Clara said. It was not a question. Abigail sat down across from her. She'd been deciding for 3 days how much to say to anyone. Clara was the only person in Millhaven who'd known Nathaniel as a boy, who understood the shape of what he'd lost and what it had cost him. His father left something, Abigail said carefully. In the study. I think Franklin knew who I was when he arranged the marriage. Clara set down her cup. He arranged it deliberately, Abigail said. I think he spent 20 years looking for that girl. And when he found her, he built a situation where his son would have to come back to her. She paused. He died before he could tell Nathaniel any of it. Clara was very quiet. Franklin Brooks, she said finally with a complicated expression. That old calculating... She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. He never did anything the simple way. No, Abigail said. He didn't. And Nathaniel knows this. He's been in that study for 3 nights, Abigail said. I think he's piecing it together. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Abigail's. Her grip was firm. How are you? She asked. Not the polite version, the real one. Abigail thought about it honestly. I'm not sure, she said. I've been carrying this for so long that now that it's out in the open, I don't quite know what to do with my hands. Clara made a short, warm sound. That's the most honest thing anyone said in this valley in years. After Clara left, Abigail went upstairs and stood at the window of her room and watched Nathaniel cross the yard below, hat pulled low coat against the February cold, moving with that particular deliberate stride. He stopped at the fence, stood there a moment looking at the ridge. Then he turned and looked directly up at her window. She didn't step back. She held his gaze through the glass. I held it too. A beat, 2 beats, 3, and then he tipped his hat to her, the way you tip your hat to someone you respect, and turned back to the fence. She pressed her hand against the cold window and thought about what Thomas had said. He watches the door every time you leave a room. She understood now what she was watching in return. The letter from Oregon arrived on a Thursday. Nathaniel's uncle was worse. The lawyer in Bend had written on his behalf the land claim would need to be resolved within 30 days, or it would go to a judge, and a judge in Oregon would not be sympathetic to a Montana ranch owner he'd never met. The Eastern Quarter was at genuine risk. Nathaniel came to find her in the schoolroom, the one she'd begun using 3 days a week, now the old building she'd been quietly restoring with Wade's help, and the labor of 4 ranch hands who'd volunteered without being asked. He stood in the doorway until the last child left, and then he came in and handed her the letter without speaking. She read it. 30 days, she said. Yes, she thought quickly. Thomas Reed's offer still stands. He came by last week and told Wade he hadn't withdrawn it. I know, Nathaniel said. Wade told me. It's a fair offer. It's charity. It's partnership, she said. There's a difference. And you know there is. She looked at him steadily. Your pride isn't worth the eastern pasture, Nathaniel. He looked at her for a moment, with something that was half irritation and half something warmer, something that lived right next to irritation in the landscape of a man who was not used to being seen clearly. You know, he said, most women don't speak to their husbands this way. Most husbands, she said, would benefit from it. He made that sound again, the low, reluctant, almost laugh. She was beginning to collect them, file them away like small treasures. I'll speak to Reed, he said. Good. He didn't move toward the door. He stood in the middle of the old schoolroom, with the afternoon light coming through the new glass she'd had fitted in the windows, and he looked at her, not assessing, not searching, just looking. The way you look at something you've decided you're glad exists. "My father," he said. "You think he planned all of this?" "I think he spent years trying to fix something he couldn't fix directly," she said. "I think he was a man who made a mistake once, whatever that debt was, whatever he owed your uncle, that he never fully resolved, and he spent the rest of his life trying to correct things sideways." She paused. "I think he found me and thought he was doing something good, something right." "By using you," Nathaniel said quietly. Not defensively, honestly. "He didn't force me," Abigail said. "I chose. You chose because you didn't have other options." "I chose," she repeated firmly, "because I had hoped for a long time that things would turn out differently for that boy in the storm. And I was not willing to stop hoping." She met his gaze without flinching. "Don't take that away from me by calling it something else." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "for 20 years. You don't get credit for what you forgot," she said. "And you don't owe me for it either." She held his gaze. "What you owe me is what you do now. Going forward, that's all." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the ridge that morning, enormous and quiet and right on the edge of something. Then voices outside weighed, and one of the hands close and loud broke it open. Nathaniel turned toward the door. Put his hat on. "Read," he said. "I'll go today." "Good," she said. He walked out. She watched the door for a long moment after he left. Then she turned back to the schoolroom and the afternoon's work, and she carried the moment with her like something she was not yet ready to put down. He came back from Thomas Reed's in the early evening, and Abigail knew immediately that something had happened. Not the land. Not the deal. She could tell by his stride that the deal was done, because Nathaniel Brooks walked differently when a problem was resolved with a looseness in the shoulders that almost never appeared otherwise. This was something else. He came in through the back door, and he had an expression she had never seen on him before. Controlled anger, barely controlled. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put coffee in front of him. He didn't touch it. "Thomas told me something," he said. She waited. "He said there's talk in town." His voice was flat and even in the particular way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. "About you. About why he comes out here. About—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "People are saying things about you, Abigail. About your character. About why a woman from a bankrupt farm would have agreed to a marriage like this." She absorbed that. She'd known it was coming. It was a small valley. She'd expected it. What she had not expected was the look on his face. "Who?" she said. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she said. "Because I want to know if it's someone you respect, so I know how seriously to take it." He looked at her sharply. "Margaret Holloway," he said, "and 2 of the women from the church committee." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Margaret Holloway was the banker's wife. Influential in the particular way that women with comfortable lives and a great deal of time were influential in small towns, through conversation, through the careful placement of doubt. "What are they saying?" she said. "That you're ambitious." He said the word like it tasted wrong. "That you set your sights on this ranch deliberately. That Thomas is—" He stopped. "That the 2 of you are—" "I understand," Abigail said. "It's lies," he said, flat and absolute. "I know," she said. "I'm not worried." He stared at her. "You're not—" "Women like Margaret Holloway talk when they're afraid of something," Abigail said. "She's been afraid of your ranch going under for 2 years because her husband holds the note on 2 of your neighbors, and she's watching which way the wind blows." She held his gaze. "Let them talk. The people who matter here know who I am." "I know who you are," he said. Low, immediate. The room shifted. She looked at him across the table, and something in her chest pulled tight. "Nathaniel," she started. "I'm going to Millhaven tomorrow morning," he said. He stood up. "I'm going to speak to Margaret Holloway's husband, and I'm going to make clear that if his wife continues spreading lies about mine, the bank will not be getting another dollar of Brooks Ranch business." That's not necessary. Yes, he said. It is. I was not looking at her with guilt or obligation or the weight of a promise 20 years old. He was looking at her with a fierce, clean protectiveness that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with choice. She pressed her lips together. "Sit down," she said again. He sat. He was still tightly wound, still furious in that quiet, contained way, but he sat. She refilled his coffee. She sat back down across from him. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning it fully. He looked at her. "Don't thank me," he said. He stopped. "This is the least I can do." "Don't diminish it," she said. "I said thank you. Accept it." A beat. Then the corner of his mouth just barely. "Fair enough," he said. Nathaniel went to Millhaven the next morning. She didn't ask what was said. She could guess some of it by the fact that Margaret Holloway sent a very stiff, very formal note 3 days later expressing her hope that any misunderstandings had been resolved. Abigail wrote back a polite, brief response and said nothing to Nathaniel about it. He noticed she didn't ask. "You're not going to ask what happened," he said that evening. "No," she said. "Most women would ask." "I'm not most women," she said. "And you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." He was quiet. "I told him that my wife is the most capable, honest person in this valley, and that anyone who suggests otherwise will find the conversation unpleasant." He paused. He agreed, immediately. "Good," she said. "Margaret was there," he said. He stopped. Something crossed his face. "She apologized. Properly. Not the note. In person." Abigail looked up. She said, Nathaniel's voice was careful now. "She said she'd been watching the two of you at church, and she had drawn conclusions, and that she'd been wrong." He paused. "She said you reminded her of someone strong, and she'd mistaken it for something threatening." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That's a more honest thing than I expected from her." "I thought so too," Nathaniel said. They sat with that for a while. Then from nowhere he said, "I used to be afraid of storms." She looked at him. After that day, the day I got lost." He was turned slightly away from her, looking at his coffee cup. "For years afterward, I was terrified of storms. My father didn't understand it. He thought I was being weak." A pause. "But I knew there was something in the storm that I'd lost. Something important. I just couldn't remember what." She kept very still. "I think I was looking for you," he said quietly. "Without knowing I was looking." She pressed her hand flat on the table. "I used to think about you too," she said. "On stormy nights." He looked up at her. "You did? Every time," she said. "I used to wonder if you were all right, if you'd made it home." She held his gaze. "You were 10 years old, and you were alone and terrified, and you still tried to make me feel safer. You talked about anything you could think of. Horses, your father's ranch, a book you'd read." She paused. "You told me the names of every horse on your father's property, in order." Something moved through his face, the ghost of a memory surfacing. "Copper," he said slowly. "The old bay gelding, and Darcy. My mother named her." "Yes," Abigail said softly. "Darcy." He pressed both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. Then he looked at her, and his voice when he spoke was rough at the edges. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart shifted. "I don't know how to love someone," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have gaps, places where I know something should be, and I can't feel it, where I know I'm supposed to understand something, and I just—" He stopped. "But I know I don't want you to leave. I know I look at you and something in me that's been silent for a very long time starts saying things I don't have words for yet." His eyes held hers. "I don't think that's nothing." She couldn't speak for a moment. "No," she said finally. "That's not nothing." He reached across the table, not to take her hand, just toward her, halfway, stopping in the open space between them. An offer, a question. She looked at his hand on the table. Then she reached across and covered it with hers. They sat like that for a long moment, her hand over his, neither of them speaking, the fire in the other room, and the February wind outside, and the whole vast quiet of the ranch around them. Then the back door slammed open. Wade Garrett came in at a run, which Wade Garrett had never done, and his face was stripped of its usual composure entirely. "Boss," he said, "we got a problem." Nathaniel was on his feet before the sentence was finished. "What?" "The eastern fence," Wade said. "Someone cut it. The whole south herd is—" He caught his breath. "They're gone, boss. Every last one." The room went cold. Nathaniel turned to Wade, and she saw it. The shift, the instant total transformation from the man who had just held his hand out across the table to the man who ran 3,000 acres and knew what a missing herd meant in February in Montana. "How many hands do we have tonight?" he said. "6. 2 are out at the—" "Get them all, now." He reached for his coat. He turned back to Abigail briefly, and in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of everything, he stopped for just a second. "Lock the house," he said, "and stay inside." "Why lock the house?" she said. Wade said the fence was cut. Their eyes met. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." She understood. This was not an accident. This was not a drifted herd. Someone had done this deliberately. He held her gaze for one moment. Something in it that was not goodbye, but was the next closest thing, the look of a man who is about to go into something hard and is leaving something behind. He hasn't had time to properly claim yet, and then he was out the door and into the dark. Abigail stood in the empty kitchen and listened to the sounds of the ranch mobilizing around her shouts, horses' boots on frozen ground, and she looked down at the table where his hand had been. She stood there for a long count of 10. Then she went to the window, then to the back door, and then, because she had never in her life been a woman who locked doors and waited inside while something happened to the life she'd built, she went to find her coat. Wade was still in the yard. "Mrs. Brooks," he said in a tone that suggested he already knew this was a losing battle. The boss said, "I know what he said," Abigail said. "Saddle me a horse, Mr. Garrett." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he went to saddle the horse. The south herd was 2 miles out, bunched against a gully they couldn't cross in the dark. Finding them took an hour. Getting them moving took another. Nathaniel worked the west side of the herd, and she took the east, and they didn't speak. There was no need to. The work had its own language, but she felt his eyes on her twice in the dark, that long look she was beginning to know as well as her own heartbeat. On the ride back, the herd settled, and moving, he pulled alongside her. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "You did," she agreed. "You didn't." "No." He was quiet for the moment. Then, "That's going to be a pattern, isn't it?" "Almost certainly," she said. He made the sound, the low, reluctant, real sound that was not quite a laugh, but was everything close to one. It came easier now. She heard it and felt the particular warmth of something earned. "The fence," she said. "You know who cut it." "I have a strong suspicion," he said. His voice had gone carefully flat. "Your uncle." "Or someone working for him," Nathaniel said. "He's not well enough to travel, but he has hands in Bend who aren't." She thought about that. "He wants you to default on the eastern quarter. If my herd suffers the bad winter loss, I can't make the payment on the note by the deadline," he said. "He doesn't want Thomas's money. He wants the land." He paused. "He always wanted the land. That's what the original debt was about. My father built something his brother thought should have been shared, and he never forgave him for it." 30 years of a grudge. She understood it even if she didn't excuse it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to Oregon," he said. "I'm going to look that man in the eye, and I'm going to settle this." He paused. "And I'm not going alone." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead into the dark, but she could see the set of his jaw and the deliberateness of what he wasn't quite saying. "You're asking me to come," she said. "I'm telling you," he said. "Same way you tell me." She heard it, the echo of her own words offered back to her. Something light moved through her chest, bright and unexpected. "Fair enough," she said. He glanced at her then. Just briefly. Just long enough for her to see in the dark in the cold on the back of a horse after an hour's hard riding. That the man beside her was not the stone-wall stranger from the church steps. He was not the closed-off, careful armored version of Nathaniel Brooks she had spent months quietly dismantling one cabinet latch at a time. He was someone else, someone she was only beginning to meet, someone she thought she was going to know for a very long time. The herd moved ahead of them through the dark, and the ranch lights glittered in the distance, and she tucked the pendant under her collar against her skin and rode beside her husband toward home. They left for Oregon 3 days later. Wade Garrett stood in the yard and watched them go with the expression of a man who had opinions he was keeping mostly to himself, which for Wade was a significant act of restraint. He'd said his piece the night before, that he didn't like the boss leaving the ranch vulnerable with the fence situation unresolved, that he trusted the hands but trusted them more with Nathaniel present, that Oregon in February was a fool's errand. Nathaniel had heard him out completely. Then he'd said, "I know, watch the south fence, and watch the house." Wade had looked at Abigail. "Yes, sir," he'd said, meaning something more than the words. The ride to Bend took 9 days. They could have taken the stage for part of it, and Nathaniel had suggested it once, and Abigail had looked at the stage schedule and said she'd rather ride, and he'd accepted that without argument, which told her something about how much he'd changed in 4 months. The Nathaniel who'd looked at her across the church altar would have insisted on the stage because it was practical and because her preference wouldn't have registered as a variable worth considering. This Nathaniel saddled her horse first every morning without being asked. Small things. She was still collecting them. The days on the trail had a different texture than anything they'd shared on the ranch. On the ranch, there was always work, always something to pull Nathaniel's attention. Sideways, always the foreman, or the herd, or the accounts ledger, standing between them and the particular discomfort of being fully present with each other. On the road, there was nothing. Just the miles and the cold and the horses and the two of them. The first 2 days were quiet. Not unpleasantly so, they'd built a working vocabulary of silence, but she could feel him thinking, processing. The memories were still surfacing in pieces she knew. He'd mentioned it twice in the days before they left, waking up with fragments. Things from his childhood that had been dark for 20 years suddenly lit again like lamps in rooms he'd forgotten existed. On the third morning, while they were breaking camp, he said without looking up from the fire, "I remembered something last night." She waited. "There was a song," he said. "You sang something, while we waited in the storm." He looked up at her. "I couldn't hear the words, just the melody. Something small and I don't know." He shook his head. "My mother used to say I had no ear for music." Abigail crouched down on the other side of the fire and thought. Then very quietly she hummed 4 bars of an old hymn, one her grandmother had taught her, simple and low and steady. Nathaniel went completely still. "That," he said. "My grandmother's. She taught it to me when I was very small." Abigail looked at him across the fire. "I used to hum it when I was frightened, to make myself feel less so." He was very quiet for a moment. "It worked," he said. "On me, at least." She felt warmth move through her chest, like something physical. They rode on. By the 5th day, the silences had become something else entirely. Comfortable in a way that went deeper than their ranch silences. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of something that didn't need words. He rode beside her instead of slightly ahead, which she'd noticed on day 2 and hadn't commented on. He matched her pace instinctively. When the terrain roughened and her horse stumbled once on loose shale, his hand shot out before she'd even registered the movement, not grabbing, not overcorrecting, just present and steady at her elbow until she had her seat again. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said, but his hand didn't move for another 10 seconds. On the 6th evening, camped in the shelter of a limestone outcropping with the temperature dropping fast, he told her about his father. Not the arranged marriage father. Not the businessman. The man. Franklin Brooks, who had been afraid of horses until he was 40 and learned to ride out of sheer stubbornness. Who had read every book he could get his hands on and kept them all and never lent any of them because he'd lent one once and never gotten it back. Who had cried exactly once in Nathaniel's memory the morning of Nathaniel's mother's funeral, and then never again, not because he didn't grieve, but because he decided that grief was something he owed her privately, not publicly. "I was not good at saying things," Nathaniel said. He showed up. That was his way of saying everything. "Like someone else I know," Abigail said. He glanced at her sideways. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it bother you that I'm not easy with words?" She thought about that honestly. "It used to," she said. "In the beginning. I thought silence meant nothing was happening." She looked at the fire. "Now I know it doesn't." He nodded. He picked up a stick and turned it in his hands. "I used to think," he said, "that if I didn't say something I couldn't be wrong about it, couldn't be held to it." He paused. "My uncle was the opposite. He said everything, loudly, and meant very little of it." He looked up. "I decided somewhere along the way that silence was safer." "Safer isn't the same as better," she said. "No," he said. "I know that now." The fire crackled between them. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to be better at it," he said. "I want you to know that. Not just because of the past, because of who you are now, what you've built." He held her gaze. "You walked into my house with nothing, and you made it into something I actually want to come home to. I should have said that months ago." She looked at him for a long moment. "That might be," she said quietly, "the most words you've ever said to me at once." The corner of his mouth moved. "Don't get used to it." "Too late," she said. He laughed. Not the almost laugh, not the low, reluctant sound, an actual real laugh, brief and genuine, and it hit her somewhere deep and warm, and she tucked it away with the firewood and the cabinet latches and the hands stretched halfway across the kitchen table. Evidence. She was building a case. She just wasn't sure yet what the verdict would be. They reached Bend on the 9th day. Nathaniel's uncle lived on the eastern edge of town, in a house that had once been prosperous and was now in the particular state of decline that comes from a man spending years fighting something rather than building something. His name was Gerald Brooks, and he was 64 years old and dying of a lung ailment that had been taking him apart for 3 years. How was also Abigail assessed within 30 seconds of meeting him, one of the most bitter men she had ever encountered. He received them in a sitting room that smelled of medicine and old grievances. He was thin, heavily blanketed with Nathaniel's coloring and none of his discipline. Where Nathaniel was contained and precise, Gerald was loose at the edges, the kind of man who had spent so long nursing his resentments that they'd started to show in his face. He looked at Nathaniel and said, "You look like your father." "I know," Nathaniel said. "Meant it as an insult," Gerald said. "I know that too," Nathaniel said evenly. Gerald's eyes moved to Abigail. He assessed her the way men his age sometimes assessed women, as accessories to the main event, things to be catalogued and set aside. "Your wife," he said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Pretty enough. Farmer's daughter, I hear." "Yes," Abigail said. "The kind who knows how to spot a weak fence from 50 yards. You should know that up front." Gerald looked at her sharply. A silence fell. Then he said to Nathaniel, "She always talked like that." "Frequently," Nathaniel said. And there was something in his voice, something that was pride plain and undecorated, that made Abigail's chest pull tight. Gerald's lawyer arrived 20 minutes later, and with him came the documents, and what followed was 3 hours of the most difficult conversation Abigail had watched in her life. Because Gerald Brooks was not simply greedy. That would have been easier. He was wounded in the way that only a sibling can wound you, in the place where you were supposed to be loved first and weren't. Franklin had built an empire on land Gerald believed should have been shared. Franklin had built a family while Gerald's had struggled. Franklin had lived well and died respected, while Gerald had lived with the taste of it for 30 years. And now Franklin was dead and couldn't defend himself. And Gerald had a legal claim and a dying man's urgency and nothing left to lose. The documents were legitimate. Nathaniel's lawyer, contacted from Billings and present by arrangement, confirmed it. A partial stake signed over legally 30 years ago in exchange for a debt Franklin had never repaid. He could have paid it, Gerald said. His voice was not loud. That was the most terrible thing about it. Any time in 20 years he could have paid it. He chose not to. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why didn't you come to him directly?" "I did," Gerald said. "Twice. Both times he said he'd handle it. Both times nothing happened." He looked at his hands. "Third time I tried, he said the debt had expired, that enough time had passed that it wasn't valid." He looked up. Legally, he was wrong. That's what these documents prove. Nathaniel absorbed that. Abigail watched him absorb it, watched him take something that could have made him defensive, and instead sit with it. "I was wrong," Nathaniel said. "About the debt, and about not settling it." Gerald's lawyer looked up from his papers. Gerald himself went very still. "I'm not here to defend everything my father did," Nathaniel said. "I'm here to settle what he should have settled himself." He paused. "What's the actual value of the Eastern Quarter fair market? Not inflated." Gerald named a number. Nathaniel looked at his own lawyer. His lawyer nodded fair. "I'll pay it," Nathaniel said. "Not with Reed's money, my own. It'll take me until fall to liquidate enough assets without damaging the ranch's operations, but I'll pay it in full." He held his uncle's gaze. "And you withdraw the claim on the land, in writing, today." The room was very quiet. Gerald looked at him for a long time. "Your father never once—" He stopped. His voice for just a moment lost its bitterness and became something older and rawer underneath. He never once just said it plainly. What he owed, just said it. "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'm not my father." Another silence. Gerald looked at Abigail, really looked this time, not assessing, just looking. "You knew who he was," he said. "Before the marriage. I can tell." She met his gaze. "Yes." "Why'd you marry him anyway?" "Because I believed in who he could be," she said, "not who he was." Gerald made a sound that was complicated and ancient, and not entirely without pain. "Franklin didn't deserve that," he said. "Not to Nathaniel, to her." "No," she agreed. "Probably not." Gerald looked at his lawyer. "Draw up the withdrawal," he said. "Full settlement by October." They settled the legal terms within an hour. The lawyer drafted the withdrawal documents. Gerald signed them with a hand that shook slightly and did not look at Nathaniel while he did. But as they were leaving, coats on papers in hand, "The whole terrible business concluded," Gerald said from his chair. "Boy?" Nathaniel stopped at the door. "Your father talked about a girl once," Gerald said. "When he was drinking, which he rarely did. A girl your boy found in a storm. Or who found him." He looked at Nathaniel steadily. "He said it was the thing he was most ashamed of. That the boy made a promise and couldn't keep it. He spent years looking for her." He paused. "He found her, didn't he?" The air in the room was very still. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He did." Gerald looked at Abigail one last time. Something moved through his face, not warmth, but its distant cousin. Acknowledgement. "You got more than he deserved," Gerald said to her. "I hope he knows that." "He's learning," she said. Gerald made that sound again. He closed his eyes. They walked out into the cold February air, and Nathaniel stood on the porch for a moment before he moved, and she stood beside him and let him have it. "He's not wrong," Nathaniel said. Quiet, not self-pitying, just honest. "About some of it," she said. He looked at her. "You're not who you were 4 months ago," she said. "Give yourself that at least." He was quiet. Then, "Come on. I want to get out of Bend before dark." They rode out of town as the light was going amber and thin, and she felt the distance behind them like something shed the uncle, the documents, the 30-year-old wound that had cut across their lives without their permission. It wasn't resolved exactly. These things rarely were. But it was settled. There was a difference. The ride back was faster. They knew the terrain now, and they pushed the pace, and something between them had shifted again. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that things shift after you've stood beside someone through something hard and discovered they don't collapse. On the second night of the return journey, camped in the same limestone shelter as before, Nathaniel said, I need to tell you something I should have said in the kitchen. She looked up from her coffee. He was looking at his hands. He was doing the thing he did when he was finding words. The slight tension at the jaw, the stillness that was actually a great deal of internal motion. When I reached for you across the table, he said, before Wade came in. He looked up. That wasn't guilt, or obligation, or the past. He held her gaze. I need you to know that. Her heart was doing something unhelpful. What was it? She asked. I don't have a clean word for it yet, he said. But it's you, the person you are, the way you talk to Rosie about her letters, like they're the most important thing in the world. The way you told Margaret Holloway's husband what you were without flinching. The way you saddled your own horse and came out into the dark after me. He paused. The way you've been patient with a man who didn't know what he had. She held very still. Nathaniel, she said carefully. I'm not finished, he said. She closed her mouth. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know there are parts of me that are still missing, still dark. I don't know if they all come back or if some of them are just gone. His voice was steady, but it was costing him something. But what I feel for you is not dark. It's the clearest thing I've got. He looked at her directly. I think I've been in love with you since before I knew your name again. I think some part of me recognized you before the rest of me caught up. The firelight moved between them. She breathed. You're getting better at words, she said. His jaw ticked. I'm being serious. I know, she said. I am too. She held his gaze. I've been in love with the idea of you for 20 years, Nathaniel, and I've been falling in love with the actual you for 4 months. She paused. The actual you is considerably more complicated than the idea. That's not exactly... And considerably better, she said. He stopped. She reached across the space between them, not halfway this time, all the way, and she took his hand. He looked down at her hand on his. Then he turned his hand over and held hers properly, his fingers closing around hers with a steadiness that was entirely him, entirely intentional, entirely chosen. They sat like that for a long time. The fire burned down, and neither of them moved to add wood, and the cold came in around the edges, and neither of them moved for that either. I want to do this right, he said finally. His voice was low. When we get back, I want to start over, properly. We can't start over, she said. We've already started. Then I want to continue, properly. Properly, she repeated. As your husband, he said. Not as an arrangement. As a man who chose you. He paused. Who chooses you? She looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd known as a frightened boy and a cold stranger and a careful student of himself, and now something new. Something still becoming. Then choose me, she said simply. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it. Brief, warm, completely certain. Done, he said. They rode into the ranch yard on a Tuesday morning 11 days after they'd left. Wade Garrett was at the fence when they came in. He looked at both of them together, the particular way they were sitting their horses now closer than before, and whatever he saw made the corner of his weathered mouth move. He tipped his hat. Boss, Mrs. Brooks. Wade, Nathaniel said. Anything happened while we were gone? Nothing we couldn't handle, Wade said. Then to Abigail specifically, Miss Rosie Hatch came by every morning asking when you'd be back. I told her Tuesday. She'll be here by noon. Abigail felt something light and warm settle through her. Tell her to bring her slate. They dismounted. The hands took the horses. Nathaniel held the back door for her as she went in, and she heard him say something quiet to Wade that she didn't catch, and she didn't need to. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee. It smelled like home. She set her bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, just feeling the return of it. Then she moved to the window and looked out at the yard. Nathaniel came in behind her. She heard him stop. Abigail, he said. She turned. He was holding something. A piece of paper official sealed from the look of it. This arrived while we were gone, he said. Wade left it on the table. She recognized the handwriting on the outside. The lawyer in Billings. The Eastern Quarter, she said. No, he said slowly, looking at the contents. His face had gone very still in a way she was learning to read. This is about my father's estate. He looked up. There are assets I didn't know about. A separate account he set aside. He stopped. She came closer and looked at the letter. The account had one named beneficiary, Abigail Brooks, née Turner, not Nathaniel. Her. Franklin had known. He had always known. And he had made sure quietly through a lawyer in a document that would only surface after his son had had enough time that the girl from the storm would never be left with nothing. She pressed her hand over her mouth. He looked after you, Nathaniel said. His voice was rough. Even before I could. She stood very still and thought about a dying old man arranging pieces on a board he'd never see finished, trying to set right something his son didn't know was broken. He loved you, she said. He just didn't know how to tell you he was sorry. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he set the letter down carefully and looked at her. I'm going to say something, he said, and I want you to let me finish. All right, she said. I have spent most of my adult life being careful, he said. Not close to people, not present. I thought it was strength. He paused. It wasn't. It was just a long way of being afraid. He held her gaze. You are the first person in my adult life who made me want to stop being afraid, who made me think that what was on the other side of it was worth the risk. His voice was steady and unhurried, and it was the most words she had ever heard from him, and every one of them was real. I don't want careful anymore. I want you. She looked at this man standing in his kitchen, in his work coat, with his father's letter on the table, and 20 years of a promise finally arrived at its destination, and she felt something in her chest come fully, completely open. Like a door she had been holding ajar for years, finally allowed to swing wide. You have me, she said. You've had me since an oak tree in a storm when we were children. She stepped toward him. You just took the scenic route getting here. Hi-mod the sound. The real one, warm and genuine. And then he reached for her, and she let him. And when his arms came around her, the particular quality of it was not tentative, not careful, not the measured correctness of an arrangement being honored. It was a man holding something he had finally decided was his to hold. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt 20 years of patient, stubborn, quietly tenacious hope settle into something solid and real and present. Outside, the ranch moved through its morning. The hands crossed the yard. A horse called from the stable. Somewhere down the road, a 7-year-old girl was already looking for her slate. Inside in the kitchen, in the particular warmth of a Tuesday morning, returned to Nathaniel Brooks held his wife and said nothing for a long time. Then, I should have said all of that months ago. Yes, she said against his shoulder. I'm going to be better at it. I know, she said. I mean it. She tilted her head back and looked at him. I know, she said again. That's why I believe you. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pressed his mouth to her forehead, brief, warm, deliberate, and held it there for a count of 3. Come on, he said quietly. Let's feed these people. She laughed, a real one, full and unheld, and turned to the kitchen. And Nathaniel Brooks, who had learned in the last 4 months to say what he meant and mean what he said, watched his wife move through their kitchen and thought with a clarity that had cost him 20 years and 4 months and a 9-day ride in February, that some things arrived at slowly and honestly, and with great difficulty, turn out to be exactly what they were always supposed to be. He picked up his coffee cup and sat at the table, and he was home. Spring came to the Brooks Ranch, the way it always did in Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week, then a frost that killed the early shoots, then sun again, stubborn and insistent, until the ground finally gave up fighting and went green. Abigail noticed the change in Nathaniel the same way. Not all at once. In arguments with himself that she watched him win slowly one day at a time. He started talking at breakfast. That was the first thing, small observations, things he'd noticed on the morning ride, a problem with the north pasture fence that he thought through out loud instead of carrying it silently all day. She learned to listen without making too much of it, the way you don't make sudden movements around something newly unafraid. He was learning the sound of his own voice in a room with another person, and it was still new enough that attention felt like pressure. She gave him space. She gave him presence. She gave him coffee, and the particular quality of her silence that said, "I'm here, I'm listening, take your time." Rosie Hatch came every morning without fail. She had decided with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old that Mrs. Brooks was the most important person in Millhaven, and she conducted herself accordingly, arriving punctually, presenting her slate with ceremony, and delivering opinions on everything from handwriting to the quality of the morning biscuits, with a frankness that made Nathaniel, on the 2 mornings a week he was home for the lesson, press his mouth together in that way that meant he was trying not to smile. "Mr. Brooks," Rosie announced one Tuesday, "your wife says you didn't used to talk very much." A silence. "That's true," Nathaniel said carefully. "She says you're getting better at it." "I'm working on it, Miss Rosie." Rosie considered him with great seriousness. "My pa says some men are like horses. They don't trust easy, but once they do, they never stop." Nathaniel looked at Abigail across the table. Abigail looked at her coffee. "Your pa," Nathaniel said gravely, "sounds like a wise man." Rosie nodded satisfied and went back to her letters. Abigail did not look up for a full minute because she did not trust her face. But later, when Rosie had gone and the kitchen had quieted and Nathaniel was pulling on his coat for the afternoon ride, he stopped beside her at the counter and said very quietly, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, "You told a 7-year-old I didn't talk enough." "I told her you were getting better," she said. "That's a compliment." He looked at her for a moment. Then he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the first time he had done that, so casual and certain that it took her a full second to register it, and walked out. She stood at the counter with her hand pressed to the side of her face and thought very deliberately, very carefully about nothing at all. These were the days she would remember. Not the dramatic ones. These ones. Thomas Reed came by in early April with a bottle of good whiskey and no agenda, which was the clearest possible sign that he had an agenda. He and Nathaniel sat on the porch in the early evening, and Abigail brought coffee, and then tactfully did not stay, because some conversations between men need the particular privacy of a porch at dusk, and she respected that. She could hear the low murmur of their voices through the kitchen window. Not words, just the rhythm of it. Easier than she would have expected 3 months ago. Nathaniel had been thawing in his dealings with everyone lately, but with Thomas. Specifically, there had been a genuine warmth, developing the careful, slow warmth of 2 men who respect each other, finding their way to something like friendship. After Thomas left, Nathaniel came inside and stood at the kitchen table with his hands in his pockets and a look she'd learned to read as he has something to say, and he's deciding how. He asked about the ranch, Nathaniel said. The finances, after the Oregon settlement. What did you tell him? The truth. That the fall payment to Gerald is manageable, but it'll be a lean year. He paused. He offered to take on a share of the spring cattle drive, split the proceeds. No interest, no claim, just partnership. She looked at him. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. Nathaniel. He looked at her. Take the partnership, she said. Thomas Reed is a good man and a fair one, and you need the hands for the drive. Your pride will survive it. His jaw moved. It's not pride. Then what is it? A pause. I don't want to owe people. Partnership isn't owing, she said. It's building. There's a difference. I've told you that before. You've told me a lot of things before, he said. And you've gradually come to understand that I'm right about most of them. He looked at her for a moment. Then, most of them. Which ones am I wrong about? He thought about it with apparent seriousness. The coffee, he said. You make it too strong. She stared at him. You're joking, she said. I never joke about coffee. She turned back to the counter. She was smiling, and she did not want him to see how much. Take the partnership, Nathaniel. I'll write to him tomorrow, he said. And she could hear it in his voice that he'd already decided before he came inside that he'd just needed to say it to her first to practice the shape of it. She understood that about him now. He thought in words he didn't always say aloud, and he was learning slowly, genuinely, to share the ones that mattered. She heard him cross the kitchen. She felt him stop behind her close, but not touching, and she held still. "Thank you," he said, quietly, meaning more than the word. "You're welcome," she said, meaning the same. The letter from Gerald Brooks arrived in May. Not from his lawyer. From Gerald himself, hand-written, the script, shaky and effortful, in the way of a sick man's handwriting, 3 pages long. Nathaniel read it at the table. He didn't say anything for a long time. Abigail went about the morning's work and did not ask, and eventually he set the letter down and said, "He's dying faster than the doctors thought." She sat down across from him. "He wrote about my father," Nathaniel said. He was looking at the letter rather than at her. "Things I didn't know. Things about when they were young." He was quiet for a moment. "My father borrowed the money from Gerald to buy the Eastern Quarter. Not to save the ranch, it didn't need saving then. He borrowed it because Gerald had it, and Franklin wanted to expand, and he thought Gerald would just give it, because they were brothers." He paused. "Gerald gave it as a loan. Franklin received it as a gift. Neither of them ever said outright which it was, and 30 years went by and it turned into—" He gestured slightly. "This." Abigail was quiet. "He doesn't want the money," Nathaniel said. "Gerald. He says keep it, put it in the land." He picked up the letter and then set it back down. "He says the land should stay whole. That's what he actually wanted. The land whole and properly cared for." His voice was careful. "He says he watched from a distance for years, and he knows what my father built. He just wanted to be acknowledged, that it wasn't given, that it was earned from something." She looked at him. "He needed to be seen," she said softly. Nathaniel looked up. "That's all he needed," she said. "To have someone say yes, there was a debt, and it was real, and you weren't wrong to feel it." She held his gaze. "You gave him that, in Bend, when you didn't defend your father." He was very still. "I should write back," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should." He wrote that evening at his father's desk in his father's study in the lamplight. She didn't read it, that was his to say privately. But she heard the scratch of the pen going for a long time, much longer than she expected, and she thought, good. Say all of it. You've been learning to say things. Say this one too. Gerald Brooks died 6 weeks later. His lawyer wrote to say that in his final amended will, the claim on the Eastern Quarter had been dissolved entirely, not settled, dissolved as though it had never existed. And there was a note attached written in Gerald's shaky hand addressed to both of them. It said, "She was right about you. You got there." Nathaniel read it and didn't speak for a while. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, and Abigail understood that was where it would stay. Joel. The spring cattle drive happened in June, with Thomas Reed's hands supplementing Nathaniel's, and it went well better than well, clean and profitable in the way of a good season. The kind that put some light back into a ranch that had been running a little gray around the edges. Wade Garrett came back from the drive, looking like a man who had rediscovered a fundamental faith in the order of things. He reported to Nathaniel in the yard for approximately 4 minutes, then came to find Abigail in the schoolroom. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, in the respectful way he'd adopted sometime around February. "The drive was good, real good." "I know," she said. "Nathaniel told me. Reckoned he would." He turned his hat in his hands. "You're good for him." She looked up. Wade was not a man who said things like that. He was constitutionally opposed to sentimentality and had expressed this through 8 months of deliberate understatement. "Thank you, Wade," she said carefully. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left without another word. She sat for a moment with the warmth of it, and then went back to Rosie's letters, because Rosie did not pause for sentiment and had been waiting with increasing impatience for 2 minutes. Clara Whitaker, married in July. It was unexpected she had been widowed for 4 years and had given every impression of preferring her own company. But the man was a doctor who had come to Millhaven in the spring and had the particular quality of seeing Clara the way Clara saw everyone else, clearly, directly, without pretense. It suited her perfectly. Abigail stood beside Clara before the ceremony, helping pin a piece of lace into her hair, and Clara said without preamble, "You look different." "Do I?" Abigail said. "From when you first came." Clara held still for the pin. "You were careful then, like you were carrying something fragile and trying not to jostle it." "I was," Abigail said. "And now?" Abigail thought about it. "Now I feel like I put it down," she said. "And it didn't break." Clara's expression in the small mirror was warm and complicated, and entirely Clara. "He loves you," she said, "in case you needed someone to say it plainly." "He's said it," Abigail said. Clara looked surprised. "Nathaniel Brooks said the words." "Multiple times," Abigail said. "He's been practicing." Clara laughed a full, real laugh, and Abigail laughed with her, and it was the best moment of that whole good summer. Nathaniel found her after the ceremony standing near the edge of the celebration, with a cup of punch and a look of contentment that he was no longer making any effort to conceal. "Clara looks happy," he said, coming to stand beside her. "She does," Abigail said. "It suits her." He was quiet for a moment. They watched the dancing, the open-air kind fiddles and laughter, the easy warmth of a summer celebration in a small town where everyone knew everyone. "Do you want to dance?" he asked. She looked at him. "You dance badly," he said, "but I'm willing to be seen doing it." She set down her cup. "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." He looked pained. "If that's the most romantic—" "Come on," she said, and took his hand and pulled him into the dancing. He was as advertised, not gifted. But he was present fully, completely present in the way he had learned to be his hand. Sure at her waist, his eyes on her face entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just missed a step, and Thomas Reed was laughing at him from the edge of the floor. "Reed," Nathaniel said without looking away from Abigail. "Mind your own business." Thomas laughed harder. Abigail looked up at her husband, the man who had handed her a cold transaction on a gray October morning, and called it a marriage, and she thought that if you had told her then where they would end up on a July evening in a field of fireflies and fiddle music, she would not have believed you. She was glad she hadn't known. The getting here had been the point. The summer passed warm and full and busy, the way good summers do, so full of daily life that you barely notice them becoming memories until they already are. The schoolroom was finished by August, properly restored, with new windows that actually kept the weather out, and a wood stove that worked, and enough space for 12 children instead of 5. Abigail had spent 4 months on it quietly and persistently with Wade's occasional help, and Nathaniel's complete logistical support. He'd ordered the lumber without being asked, and arranged the delivery, and said nothing about it, except when she raised an eyebrow. "You were going to need it eventually. I just moved the timeline up." She had looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she'd said. "You're welcome," he'd said, and walked out. And she'd heard from the yard at a distance he probably thought was sufficient. The sound of him humming low under his breath. 4 bars of her grandmother's hymn. She'd stood in the middle of the new schoolroom and pressed both hands against her face and breathed and laughed quietly into her own palms. He had listened to her hum it for months and absorbed it without ever saying so. The way he absorbed everything he cared about, completely, silently, and permanently. She loved him so thoroughly, it sometimes surprised her. In September, her parents came to visit. Her father walked the ranch with Nathaniel for 2 hours, while her mother sat at the kitchen table and looked at Abigail with the careful reading expression of a woman who had spent 30 years learning her daughter's face. "You're happy," her mother said, not a question. "Yes," Abigail said, "really happy. Not managing." "Mama." "I asked because I needed to hear it plainly." Her mother wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "When you drove away last October, I thought—" She stopped. "I thought I'd sent you into something that might take more than it gave." "It gave more," Abigail said. "Considerably more." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the way her mother nodded when something had been settled internally, and reached across the table and squeezed Abigail's hand. Her father, coming in from the yard with Nathaniel, was mid-sentence about winter grazing rotation, and did not stop talking for approximately 20 minutes, which was the longest Abigail had ever heard him speak to anyone outside the family. Nathaniel was listening with his full attention, asking questions, and her father, her quiet, careful, formal father, was talking the way he talked when he trusted someone. Completely. Without reservation. That evening, sitting on the porch after supper, her father said to Nathaniel, "You take care of her." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said. "She'll tell you she doesn't need it." "She tells me that regularly," Nathaniel said. "I take care of her anyway." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good man." 2 words. From Harold Turner, that was a cathedral. Abigail, inside at the kitchen window, heard every word of it and did not cry, and almost meant that. October came and brought the anniversary. 1 year. She had not said anything about it, had not been sure she would. But Nathaniel knew he kept track of dates the way he kept track of fence lines and grazing rotations, methodically and without making a show of it, and on the morning of the day, he was gone before she woke. She came downstairs to find the kitchen empty. No note. She made the coffee and stood at the window and thought, not anxiously, just curiously. He did things in his own time and his own way, and she had learned to trust that. He came back mid-morning with Rosie Hatch beside him on his horse, which was so unexpected that Abigail opened the back door and simply stared. "Mr. Brooks said I could come," Rosie announced, sliding down from the saddle with enormous confidence. "He said you needed company today." "Did he?" Abigail said. Nathaniel dismounted. He looked slightly self-conscious in the way of a man whose plan had seemed more dignified in his head. "She wanted to come," he said. "And I thought—" "It was a good thought," Abigail said. He relaxed. Rosie presented her slate, which she'd brought specifically, and announced that she had learned to write a whole sentence and required an audience. The sentence was in full. "Mrs. Brooks is the best techer in Montana." The spelling of teacher had been attempted 3 times. Abigail could see the erasure marks and was still slightly off, and it was the most perfect thing she had ever read. "That's an excellent sentence, Rosie," she said. "I practiced all week," Rosie said with dignity. Nathaniel, over Rosie's head, caught Abigail's eye. Something passed between them, the particular private language of 2 people who have built a life together, who share the same small joys and find them large enough. After Rosie went home, walked home by one of the ranch hands. Because the afternoon was getting long, Nathaniel came to find Abigail at the fence. She was standing where she stood sometimes in the evenings, looking at the ridge. He came and stood beside her. Shoulder to shoulder, now not almost. "1 year," he said. "1 year," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I want to say today. I've been thinking about it for a month." She waited. "I know I came into this badly," he said. "I know the beginning was not what either of us deserved. I know there were months when you held more of this than I did when you were patient with a man who didn't know what he had." He paused. "I know I can't give you back those months." "I don't want them back," she said. "They made us what we are." He looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. Her heart moved. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Again, properly. Not in a gray church with 11 people and no celebration and a man reading vows like a land contract. He reached into his coat pocket. "I want to ask you, knowing who you are, and choosing you entirely, with nothing owed and nothing arranged, and nothing between us but what we've built." He held something out to her. It was the pendant. Her pendant. His pendant. The one he had carved at 10 years old with a child's hands and a child's absolute faith in the future. But it had been remade, not replaced. The original wood was there, she could see it, but set now in a simple band of silver made into a ring. The initials on the back, still visible, still there, part of it. N.B. The promise made permanent. She looked at it for a long time. "Where did you—" "Jeweler in Billings," he said. "I took it in August. Told him I needed it to become something that could be worn every day without losing what it was." He paused. "He said it was unusual work. I told him it was an unusual situation." She pressed her lips together. "Nathaniel Brooks," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. If you made me cry at this fence in front of the whole south pasture. Wade's on the north side today, he said. That is not the point. Abigail. His voice was quiet and completely certain. Will you marry me? She looked at him, this man who had said her name in a church and not known her, who had left firewood without words and fixed latches without asking and ridden 9 days through February, and stood in front of a dying bitter man and said plainly, I am not my father, this man who had learned slowly and honestly and at real cost to be present, to be chosen, to choose. I already did, she said. I'm asking you to do it again, he said, knowing everything, choosing on purpose. She took the ring from his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the old wood, the silver, the initials. 20 years of a promise finally given the shape it had always been working toward. She held it out to him. Then put it on, she said. He took her hand. He held it the way he held everything he meant to keep steadily, entirely, without hesitation. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. She thought he had probably measured 3 times. She looked at it on her hand. Then she looked at him. I choose you, she said. I chose you on a day when you were 10 years old and terrified and trying to be brave. I chose you again in a gray church when you didn't know me. I chose you every morning of this year when I could have been somewhere else. She held his gaze. I will keep choosing you. That's not a feeling, Nathaniel. That's a decision. He looked at her for a moment, the full, open, unhidden look that had taken him months to learn, and now came naturally, and then he pulled her to him, and she went, and his arms around her had the particular quality they always had. Certain, chosen, present. They stood at the fence in the October light, with the ridge behind them, and the ranch spread out in front of them, and everything. They had built the schoolroom, and the partnerships, and the slow, patient work of 2 people learning each other. Each other, honestly, was real and solid and theirs. I love you, he said, against her hair. Easily the way he said it now, practiced into fluency. I should say that first. I keep getting the order wrong. You said it fine, she said. I love you, he said again. And I'm glad you didn't tell me on the first day. I wasn't ready. I know, she said. I'm ready now. I know that too, she said. He held her tighter. She felt him breathe. Somewhere behind them, the ranch moved through its afternoon. The hands worked. The horses called. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the land that was theirs, fully undisputedly, finally theirs, and the October wind came down off the ridge and moved through the pines with a sound like something old settling into place. Rosie Hatch, halfway home on her horse, would tell her mother that evening that Mr. and Mrs. Brooks had been standing at the south fence for a very long time, just standing there together, and that Mrs. Brooks had been wearing something shiny on her hand that she hadn't been wearing in the morning. Rosie's mother would smile and say nothing. Wade Garrett, coming in from the north pasture, would see them from a distance, assess the situation in approximately 2 seconds, turn his horse quietly in the other direction, and find something to do on the north fence for another hour. Thomas Reed, told the news 3 days later, would say simply, "About time," and mean it as the highest possible compliment. Clara Whitaker would arrive the following Tuesday, with no excuse, and a bottle of good wine, and the expression of a woman whose faith in the proper order of things had been confirmed. And Abigail Brooks née Turner, who had carried a carved wooden pendant for 20 years and chosen every day to keep believing in the boy who had made it, would stand in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning with her grandmother's hymn on her lips and a ring on her finger that was the oldest and the newest thing she owned, and she would think, this is what a kept promise looks like. Not the dramatic version, the real one. The one that took time and honesty and the particular courage of 2 people deciding every day to choose each other on purpose. That is what love is when it's real. Not a feeling that arrives, a decision that stays. Nathaniel came in from the yard, stamping the cold from his boots, and looked at her at the counter. Coffee's strong again, she said without turning around. I know, he said. I like it. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that look, the open, warm, entirely unguarded look that had taken 1 full year to arrive and now lived on his face like it had always been there. Liar, she said. Completely, he said. And Nathaniel Brooks, who had forgotten a promise and found his way back to it across 20 years and a hard winter and 9 days in February. And everything that came after, smiled at his wife in their kitchen on an October morning, fully without reservation, with nothing held back, and the promise at last was whole.